Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. Hey, everybody. This is Tracy Stuckrath with the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm coming home from a red-eye flight from New Orleans and the National Association of Catering and Events convention. We're going to talk about that on a different show. But you are here listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. And on the show, each week, I talk to experts in all facets of food and beverage about food and beverage and how to create safe and inclusive and sustainable food and beverage experiences. And on today's show, I'm excited to have my guest who is part of and part founder of a new network that I'm a part of, which is called Nitty Grits Podcast. And his name is Bryan Dias, and he is the host and executive producer of the NOLAdrinks show with Bryan Dias. So hi, Bryan. How are you?
Hey, Tracy. Thanks. I'm doing great. Welcome back home.
Thank you. And I actually, I was in New Orleans a couple of weeks ago, last month, I guess it was. Great little, it's an awesome city. So, and you have this show talking about food. I mean, the title is drinks, but you talk about drinks and food and culture.
Right.
I mean, that's just all intertwined in New Orleans, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Tracy. It's what I like to always say is it's sort of a tapestry here, and connecting food and drink and music and art and architecture and all these other things that go on in this place. It's actually really easy. And some people might think, well, how does all that kind of come together? And the example I was just giving you before we went on the air, the sheer number of songs of music that comes out of this region, the references to food and drink in the lyrics is monumental. It's like every other song, right? And it's just very easy to make these connections. So it kind of started as a show a little bit more focused on drinks way back when, but has really kind of turned into a much broader conversation, which is really not that hard to pursue. No,
and I was listening to a couple of your episodes, to get ready for this. And what I found intriguing was that so there was a conversation that you had, I think it was back in 2018, but and I'm not going to say the names because I'm going to mutilate them, but somebody who utilizes a wheelchair, somebody who is visually impaired. And that's such a cultural part that doesn't even have anything to do with food and drink, but they all work in the food and drink in the hospitality industry and bringing their life culture, and what they live on a daily basis into what they do for work was intriguing.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really fun show. There's an event that happens here under normal times called Tales of the Cocktail, and it's usually every July. It's the largest spirits and bartender convention in the world. And it's a really important event to New Orleans because it's usually low season here. So it's a shot in the arm for the economy, because it involves bartenders in the spirits industry. Fancy that, good tippers. So people are really happy to have, several thousand bartenders and spirits people here because they do pretty well. And it's a great organization. And I'll spare you all this, but they went through a leadership change a few years ago for the better. And it's Tales of the Cocktail Foundation has become a true educational foundation. And the people who are involved or who were involved in taking it over and now run it are pretty good friends of mine. So I started working with them to develop shows based on some of the seminars that they would do. And the seminars they would do would tackle social issues in the hospitality and liquor industry. So the show that you're talking about was one, kind of the second round of the show. We did one the year before with a similar set of guests. Jackie Summers, who is an African-American man, a distiller. He produces the Sorel liqueur, which is a Caribbean-inspired liqueur. I believe he was actually the first African-American male to get a distillery license.
Wow.
In the States several years ago. And a great guy. And he was the moderator of the panel. You mentioned Yannick Benjamin. Yannick had an accident and is now in a wheelchair. Noted New York sommelier, opened up a restaurant called Contratto in Brooklyn just recently, and it's on fire. And his whole restaurant is built around accessibility for those with physical challenges, as well as being awesome food and drink. Apparently, I haven't gone yet. Samara Davis, who started the Black Bourbon Society, which is a bourbon appreciation group for African Americans principally. And Lynette Marrero. And Lynette is a noted bartender in New York City. She founded an event called Speed Rack, which is an all-female bartender competition designed to, one, support women in the industry, but also raise awareness about breast cancer.
Oh, wow. And and they come out, and then our friend Tiffany, the drinking coach,
Tiffany Garden.
Yeah. And she was on the show a couple of months ago too, back in March. But it's, and how she brings in stories about Black history with every cocktail she makes. It's intriguing. And I'm looking at the definition of culture. And this is from Merriam-Webster. It says the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. And so those all contribute to how we eat and how we drink.
Absolutely.
And and what you talk about in the guests that you have and the guests that I have, it's when we're ordering food and beverage for events, we really need to take that stuff into consideration.
Absolutely. Tracy, when we, especially, and I know, look, food and drink and music and all these things are a part of culture anywhere you go.
Right.
There's no way you get away from that in some fashion. In New Orleans, it's quintessential, I guess. However, it's one of the top places I've ever been where it is so ingrained in the culture, just from top to bottom, left to right, however you want to say it. And so even just the idea of going out to a restaurant here, or going out to a bar here, is a cultural experience. And it's the case anywhere, but it amazes me how much business or information is transmitted when we can do this shoulder to shoulder at a bar. A real common thing that happens here, you knock off a little early on a Friday. Hey, I'm going to lunch on Friday. And then you just don't come back right to the oven. And it's because you're actually going to the bar and you're going to go to happy hour, and you actually end up doing business, or you end up talking culture. You end up meeting people, both visitors and locals alike. And it's just part of the fabric here. And you're absolutely right. It's I don't know how you separate these things. Food and drink are a cornerstone of culture. Clearly, we all know that.
Right. And I think it sometimes gets lost when we're potentially thinking about where we're, having a meeting. It's just that standard banquet menu that you get.
Right.
Before we got on the show, we were talking about some of your previous work before you hosted the show, and that was in the nonprofit world. And I thought something that was really, I keep saying intriguing, so this is all intriguing to me, was that the work that you did with the individuals who work, the migrant workers who work on wine in wineries and vineyards, and educating them so that they understand the value of what they do. And I think that the workers in the hospitality industry, from the growers to the pickers to the servers, plays into the culture of food and beverage as well. Absolutely.
I think it's sometimes using that example that you just gave of talking about vineyard workers in California. I grew up in and around the wine industry, sort of indirectly for a while, but then my parents had a small vineyard in the San Francisco Bay Area. And this is after I had worked, spent about a decade working in environmental nonprofits. And principally I was doing, do you want me to go down this road to kind of get back?
Please do. Yeah.
Sure, no problem. So I did coral reef work for about 10 years or close to 10 years, principally marine protected area stuff in the developing world. Prior to that, I had been a scuba instructor. And then my graduate education is in international environmental policy. So this all kind of like love of water, love of diving, love of coral, love of travel in different parts of the world. So this sort of, informed a lot of who I am. And then getting involved, I really, making a long story short on that front, got tired of long haul international travel and not being home very often. And so I switched gears and got into the wine industry because I had always been around it. and started working in different capacities there. Ran a couple tasting rooms in California and stuff like that, helped open up a winery. But then I started consulting in a really cool wine region called Lake County, which is north of Napa. A lot of people don't know, because people know Napa, Sonoma, maybe Mendocino. Lake County sits to the east of Mendocino, north of Napa, and those four kind of form almost like a rectangle, and that's the North Coast wine region. And the county is almost kind of like the ugly stepchild of the North Coast region, just because it doesn't get the love. It's a little harder to get there, that kind of thing, but produces extraordinary wine grapes. And one of the things that's an issue in wine growing really anywhere, but especially in California, is, who provides the labor? Wine depends on grapes coming out of the field, right? You got to grow them, then you got to pick them. And that's where it really all starts. And most of the people that do that are folks that are immigrant, itinerant farm workers, principally from Central America. And this is probably not too surprising, but a lot of these people, they're working and they're picking, and it's a seasonal job in many cases. But then it's kind of like, as I was telling you before we went on the air, you pick your cluster of grapes, you put it in the bin. Where does it go from there as far as the vineyard worker perspective goes? And we worked on a program called the Master Vineyard Own program there that was designed to educate vineyard workers on growing grapes from a management perspective, a vineyard management perspective, all the way through the winemaking process, the wine tasting process, actually
that's awesome.
guided tastings and all of this, to create opportunities for people to advance in the industry. And even if anything, no pun intended, understand what the fruits of their labor are producing. But finding people that have achieved success in the wine industry by virtue of moving maybe into winemaking or becoming a vineyard manager, these things. And we don't have wine in this country in particular without these people. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. And the same thing works with hospitality workers, right? Hospitality workers, especially in New Orleans, food and drink is the culture that we export and sell to tourists. And art and architecture and a few things, but they're the ones who create it, right? I mean, the culture is created by those people because that's the backbone of our economy here, and they're the backbone of that industry.
That's so true, and we have to think. And you're talking about that, and there's an article that I still need to post, but I found the other day, and I think it's a video and an article. But Corona just started a plastics fishing competition.
Okay, yeah.
They did it in Mexico, and what they did is they realized that a lot of these fishermen in Mexico, and actually probably all around the world, they're picking up more plastic than they are fish now. And the fish that they are getting are much smaller because, just the nature of our trash. And so they decided to actually do this fishing competition that they are paying the fishermen, and they partner with some recycling companies, paying the fishermen the same amount they would pay them for fish for the plastic to help clean the water. And that in that process, they're doing the same thing that you were doing, is educating them on, we need to get this plastic out of the water so that you can actually get back to fishing. Right.
Yep. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think it's awesome. It's
really great. And I'll tell you something, Tracy, that since we're on the subject, having done the coral reef work that I mentioned, the plastic problem is so amazingly persistent and so amazingly widespread. One anecdote, we had a project site in a region of Indonesia called Raja Ampat, which is in the far eastern portion of the country. The provincial capital sits on the island of New Guinea, which, the other half of the island is the country of Papua New Guinea, where we work as well. But where we were doing this project work in the marine protected area, it is a 6-hour boat ride. There's no air access whatsoever to this place. One eco resort was built out there, a very beautiful place, trying to be very responsible. This is some of the most remote coral reef environments, if you look at it from the perspective of a tourist perspective of visiting. Right. 14 little villages on this island of Misul, which was the nearest areas of urban, well, they're not urban, but areas where people lived. And you would be out on, so point being is some of the most remote coral reefs in the world from that perspective. And you'd be out on the boat and you would see rafts of plastic floating in the water. So, if it's there, the point is it's everywhere, and it's plastic bags and flip-flops and all of the other things that are out there constantly floating in the water. You can't get away from it. I mean, it's a serious problem that needs to be seriously addressed. The amount of plastic that we burn through, and cheap plastic, disposable plastic, non-biodegradable, it's a huge problem. In restaurants, it's the same thing. There's so much waste with plastic material.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so I just got back from Vegas, and one of my favorite time in Vegas is exercising in the morning on the Strip, because there's very rarely anybody there. But my thing that I do is every single person that's there, squeegeeing the window, the railings that are all glass, and polishing the brass and cleaning up I thank every single one of them that I see, because they're up at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, cleaning the Strip so that it's not the cleanest sidewalk in the world, but it's cleaner than you would expect it to be, probably, because they're there doing that work.
Absolutely.
And there was a lady with an actual hand mopping the sidewalk the other day. And I'm like, I literally stopped her and I'm like, thank you so much. It's got to be a hard job. And that's still part of our food and beverage culture, and the culture of Vegas being this huge hospitality network, right?
Yep.
And I want them to realize that they're very much part of that culture.
It's a great point. Look, we have an analog here in New Orleans called Bourbon Street. Probably people have heard of it. And that same exercise that you were just describing goes on a daily basis on Bourbon Street. And it's actually, I enjoy being there at that time as well, because you see, it's a sort of rinse and repeat thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
This goes on. The bars are open until whatever hour. Obviously, times are a little different now, but typically, bars are open until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And then the street kind of quiets down a little bit. And then that next morning, the shopkeepers are outside. So in many cases, I hate to be crass, but it's like hosing the vomit off the street to start over again. And the beer trucks are, scores of beer trucks are coming down the street to deliver beer to reset for the next day. Because when you consider the volume of what people go through on that street on a daily basis, not enough room for them to store more than a day or two worth of product. So, it's just constant reboot every 24 hours of what goes on. And again, that's the culture, at least for a certain angle of the tourism that we export here in New Orleans. It doesn't happen without those people doing that every single day.
Exactly. And it's something that we take for granted for sure. Right. People just come out there on the streets. So, jumping topic a little bit, the one question that I talk about, or that I ask all my guests, is what does safe, inclusive, and sustainable food and beverage experiences look like to you? And I think I want to understand from all of the guests that you have, what perspective have you gotten from that in a variety of different ways? I'm like, you've learned from so many people over the years what that means, and it means something different to everybody. So can you shed some light on what that means?
Yeah. Wow. That's
loaded question.
Yeah. It's really, I've been very fortunate, Tracy, as you said, to have a pretty wide breadth of terrific guests, and my guests are the ones who I'm not used to this being the guest, so it's, they drive the show, and it actually, on almost every show that I do, I get the opportunity to learn something, and I learn, which is great. It's kind of why I do it. And to answer your question directly, I guess what's always been important to me is stuff that we've even kind of touched on, is making sure that we're recognizing everything as much as possible that has to happen to allow you to enjoy a meal in a restaurant, enjoy a cocktail at a bar, enjoy a family cookout, whatever the case may be, and making sure that we're understanding, where it comes from, who's been involved, where the culture comes from. In New Orleans, I think a good example, a lot of people associate New Orleans with Bourbon Street and the French Quarter, but in reality, probably, I will make up some number, 95% of the culture doesn't come from the French Quarter in New Orleans. It comes from the surrounding neighborhoods. And that is like, the people who are your line cooks from certain neighborhoods grew up in families of food culture. People who are chefs, people who are servers, bartenders, back of house, front of house, doesn't really matter. And that's what all those people that descend on the French Quarter to work every day are coming from the neighborhoods, and they're bringing their culture with them. But lots of times their stories are not recognized because they might live in a non-touristy area. They might be a person of color. They might be somebody who comes from an economically disadvantaged background.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a huge part of things to me. Also, the environmental sustainability behind things, cultural sustainability is important when we talk about mezcal is one of my favorite spirits because, it's produced in Mexico, but largely still produced by small family distillers or village level distillers that often work in co-ops. And we can talk about agave and stuff if we want to, but that's important to me too, that, we should be paying. People go, man, mezcal's so expensive. It needs to be expensive because people need to be paid up and down the supply chain a living wage. We need environmental protection for the agave. We need cultural protection for the people that actually produce it. So maybe I didn't really answer your question exactly, but it's just having these stories shared and letting people know where this stuff comes from. And to me, there's a story on every plate. There's a story in every glass, just like there's a story in every song.
I love that.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
And, I always find it, I don't know about you, I'm guessing you're the same. I find that it's more enjoyable when you know what the story is. It just heightens the appreciation for what it is that you're eating and drinking and the environment you're in and the company that you're with.
100%. And because it's like learning your grandmother's recipe because my grandmother had this succotash recipe and my uncle and I cannot figure out how she made it. And she's passed away. She's been dead for 12 years. So we'll never know what she did, but it's like, you want to know that story and how she did it. But, also I don't know why this came to mind, but I'm a Maryland girl. So I eat Maryland blue crabs. The pickers who pick the crab meat to put it in the container to buy it, we pick crabs here at our house, every summer, and it's tedious, but I don't mind doing it. But I have to thank all of those people, men and women who pick them for me to just eat crab out of the plastic container.
Right. We do a very similar thing here with crawfish so we have a crawfish boil. It's called a feed in other parts of the world. I'll tell you a really funny story really quick. My wife, adorable wife, she's from here, from New Orleans originally.
Okay.
When we first got together, she was out in California, and there was a charity thing going on. It was I think it was either a lobster or a crab, probably, and it was a crab feed. And she's going to kill me for telling the story. But so she was asking me offline, not with my parents, because that's who we were going with. She's like, well, what do y'all feed the crabs? And I was like, well, we don't. You would call it a boil. She's like, oh, okay, I get it now. Yeah. But the same thing, Tracy, goes on here with crawfish, where you do a crawfish boil when it's in season, which we're pretty much done with now. Weird stuff goes on where people, farm stuff. But the height of it's the spring. And, you have a family crawfish boil, and after the crawfish is done and you pour it all out on the table. So, you do the boil where you've got corn on the cob and potatoes and citrus and sausage and the crawfish, of course, is a boil. And every time a batch comes out of the big boiling kit, you put newspaper down on a table out in the backyard and you just dump the whole thing across the table, and everybody starts, picking at the crawfish, and you're kind of eating with your hands, and it's really fun and social. And then after that's all done, people will sit around afterwards and you pick, the crawfish, like the heads and the tails and stuff, and get the rest of the meat out, because then everybody wants to make like crawfish bread and things like that. So there's a social and cultural aspect to after you've done stuffing yourself from the boil, that you're pulling all this stuff out and everybody takes bags home to go do something with the little bits of meat. And no crawfish boil should be complete without that process, I think.
Wow, that's something new I learned. I mean, we don't do that with the crabs here. I mean, we could make some crab stock, but that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's neat and it's fun, and I stink at it. So I generally, like, my wife's really good at it. So I stand around. So my job during that time, Tracy, is I'll run drinks.
Okay.
So, like certain white wines go pretty well with crawfish, or cold beer. Some people would argue there's really no choice besides cold beer. So it's like, you all are busy over here picking the crawfish after the boil is over. I will run drinks because I can actually do that competently. That's where my skill ends there.
Hey, that's a good skill. It's fun to have. And people appreciate it because you got to wipe your hands and then to go get your drink. And so now, that's a very important job.
Exactly.
So then it brings me to like oyster shucking, and it reminds me of the Atlanta when I lived in Atlanta for 22 years, and there was always every spring there was the I'm going to forget the name of the restaurant, but they had an oyster Saturday and Sunday, an oyster fest, and just the skill set of shucking oysters all day long as well. But now, and I'm going to bring it back to our environmental aspect of it, right? Because I don't remember, and I didn't pay attention to when I was, attending that festival, what happened to those oyster shells, but now people are, taking those and putting them back into the ocean to make sure that where the oysters are coming from are actually, kept up and reestablished.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And
go ahead. Please.
I was going to say, and you can find places in the state. I mean, here in North Carolina, I think I have to drive it 30 to 45 minutes to drop off my oysters if I want oyster shells to the venue to do that. But there's more and more companies that are doing that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's here. What's also pretty common is you'll find them in non-paved roads and driveway material.
Mm-hmm.
And another, good way, because we certainly consume a lot of oysters in this part of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so many different kinds of oysters, which is intriguing. And I learned on another episode, or it was actually for an article that I wrote for Meetings Today, that, seafood is seasonal, just like fruits and vegetables are seasonal. And, the fish migrate to different parts, and with global warming, that's impacting, where they go and how they get there. And, so there's so much to learn about food culture, and that just is like the fishermen of our world. That's a whole nother culture.
Absolutely. It's interesting here, I think, when we talk about maybe shrimp for a second, because we're known for barbecued shrimp, which is not actually barbecued, and all kinds of shrimp etouffee, of course, and these different recipes that New Orleans is famous for. And shrimp is very seasonal here. And part of what's been created, I mean, crawfish, when you're seeing crawfish boils year round that I referenced earlier, crawfish season generally starts towards the end of, like February-ish is the early part of the season. You'll see some people trying to do it in January and stuff, but usually, and it's meant to sort of coincide with Easter and eating fish, not eating meat, and so on. So really the high point of it is in the spring. And we're seeing it year round because it's being driven a lot by tourist demand, and the same goes with shrimp. So, I mean, I find it troubling, I guess I'll use that word, where, shrimp on menus year round here, and, half the year the shrimp is actually not from this area, it's from Vietnam.
Right.
And, and I get that people are in business and you come to New Orleans and you want shrimp etouffee. And I mean, certainly there's farming and stuff that's going on. It's been a really rough industry for other reasons this past couple of years as well.
Right.
But, it's a problem. We're meant to eat seasonally. And, it's like with produce, all that kind of stuff that, and look, I'm as guilty as the next person that there are certain things I like to eat. I like to eat lettuce. I like salads. So I like to eat lettuce year round and so on. But, trying to eat seasonally as much as possible. And when you're going to visit a place, even coming to New Orleans, don't be angry if there's not crawfish on the menu because it's November. And actually, it's not going to be very good then anyway. Right. Mm-hmm. Come in the spring when it's good.
Yeah. And I don't think we think about that. And I think I told you this story. I don't know if I did, but I mean, I was in China to speak, and on the menu of this restaurant was Boston lobster. And I actually ordered it, and I'm like, okay, this is probably not, it is definitely not the most sustainable thing for me to order, right? It was darn good, but thinking about that, how that lobster got all the way from there to China, and to be fresh, which I'm sure it was frozen, but to get there. Right. But we do need to think about that, and talking to our local farmers, and I think there are more and more chefs that are, hotel wise as well as restaurant. I think restaurants are a little bit easier to work with local farmers because the yield that they need is not as high as a convention center or a hotel.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I think it's really changed a lot, Tracy, where people are, at least, and sort of, you're asking me that earlier, I just want people to be cognizant of these things. Mm-hmm. And I am not some paragon of, I only eat what's in season that I can forage from my backyard. It's not quite that stringent by any stretch. But just, working with local food producers, working with what's in season. Another topic that I find really fascinating that we do shows on from time to time is, and this may seem kind of obvious to some people, but it's really not been a trend until recent years or more widespread, where the bar works with the kitchen. And what I mean by that is like, okay, so let's go out. A really good example when beets are in season. And beets oh yeah, absolutely. And they're becoming more commonly used in cocktails. They make delicious cocktails, by the way. And so the idea is, okay, let's get with the kitchen. What's the kitchen bringing in today for this, what's in season and what the specials are going to be, or what's on the big restaurants now. We know more boutique restaurants and stuff will change their menus up on a frequent basis, even daily basis, to just do sort of, follow what's in season and what they can source locally. But, with the beet thing, it's like, the kitchen's going to have this fresh beet salad on the menu. And the bartender, bar director, whatever, will go, here's a great cocktail that I can use the beets. I can use leftover parts of things that the kitchen would normally discard. Citrus we waste so much citrus in bars that when you're using citrus to cook with, using citrus peels to make a tincture or an oil to use and drink or use as a garnish another way. So just even these conversations that I think, need to be continued to happen or need to continue to happen. Another great, it saves you money too. You deal with that all the time with event stuff. I want people to understand, again, what is seasonal, but how are ways that the places that you're patronizing being creative to reduce waste and yet still bring you, yummy stuff.
Exactly. And it's so important and drinks, because mixology, bartender, whatever term that you want to utilize, and even, for the people who are making those drinks, but then you also have the types of drinks, the cocktails, and even the seltzers and things like that are infusing food into those drinks and herbs as well is really important to understand. And if we're doing it as sustainably as possible, do you have a rooftop garden? Which means that I want to bring in Tiffanys Garden, Tiffany Barrier's garden in Atlanta. And I was just trying to Google it. Do you remember the name of it?
Yeah, it's actually, it's in this case, it's not Tiffany. It's her partner in crime, Kiata. Okay. Yeah, and Kiata and Tiffany are really good friends of mine. And Kiata's a terrific bartender from the Atlanta area. And so I believe it's Paradise Garden is what it's called. And she started a community garden in Atlanta that is by and for bartenders. So the whole idea is plant stuff that you can use for garnish, for making bitters, for making oil infusions, blah, 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 all that good stuff. And it's entirely, worked by the bartenders themselves. And then they obviously are allowed to, enjoy their harvests and use those products. And it's a really cool, if I'm not mistaken, Kiata told me that they, took over an area used a lot in an area that, needed some development or was just blinded. And it was probably a better way to put it. And it's a super wonderful program. And to me, it kind of speaks to this whole big picture thing that we're talking about, but locally, local action to make that happen.
That's awesome. And I just Googled and found that article in my former job, Atlanta Magazine. I used to work there, has an article on it, and need to de-stress. Restaurant and bar workers need to de-stress. And so a bartender created a community garden to help with that. So Kiata, thank you for that. That's pretty cool. Yeah. And I need to come visit you in 2 weeks when I'm there. I want to definitely come see it. So with all of the conversations that we've had, what do you wish people knew about food, drink, and culture, and how they intertwine?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it kind of harnesses a lot of what we've talked about already, that, knowing where things come from and being really appreciative of how it makes it into your belly, I guess is a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And like we've talked about, highlighting, especially in this day and age where we're in this world of celebrity chefs, which I think might actually be kind of waning. I was having a conversation the other day with Liz Williams, who who's the founder of the Food and Beverage Museum and my co-executive producer on the Nitty Grits podcast, and I know we'll talk about.
Yep.
And we were talking about the celebrity chef thing kind of waning maybe a little bit. And people are more interested, like instead of just constantly watching these shock reality shows on cooking channels that are those, people are wanting to watch actual cooking shows again more and more. But, that's always, or in recent years, I should say, that's been in really decades, front and center. And like I said, New Orleans ticks based on tourism. It's the most important part of the city's economy. And 92,000 workers pre-pandemic, I think, is what make up that industry.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, in a city that's about 375,000. Now,
wow, that's mind-boggling. Yeah.
It gives you a perspective, right, of just how big it is and how important it is. The lion's share of those people are not celebrity chefs. And certainly we have those here. But, it's all the people along the way that make all of this happen through hard work. Lots of times these are generational families. I mean, you'll see people that are servers in some of the famous New Orleans restaurants where their grandfather was a server in that restaurant.
Really?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Or worked in the kitchen in that restaurant. And so there's a generational component to all this. But, all of these things I think are just so important for people to appreciate where it all comes from and who's involved. And if you're talking about wine, it starts with vineyard workers and grapes in the field. And if you're talking about food, it starts with the farmer and their field. Talking about mezcal, it starts with the little village in Mexico and the family that's distilling it. And making sure that from there to how it ends up in your glass or on your plate, I think it's fun. I mean, I think it's cool to know that stuff. And like I said earlier, I think it heightens your enjoyment of it all.
Right. Yeah. I definitely agree. And I don't want you to greenwash it and say, oh, we got this farm, we use this farm, but really truly get to know who they are. And, even if you're taking food waste or reclaiming food and donating it to, afterwards because you've produced too much, getting to know the people that you're giving it to as well, I think is just as important too.
Great point. Absolutely.
And it's just very cyclical. The one quote that I use all the time is from James Beard, and it is, "Food is our common ground. It's our universal experience." And it's just, and it comes from a little thing in the ground and grows and then goes into our body. And, well, we won't go to the further part of that, but yeah.
We're not talking about chlorophyll, are we? That's way above my pay grade.
Right. Yeah, no, we're not doing that. But I really enjoy it too. I love learning the different stories and what's going on and how somebody got there. And the museum that you just mentioned, the Southern Food and Beverage Museum that Liz runs and founded, I should say. And she was on the show a couple episodes ago, but going through and how she even designed the museum based on the floor plan from the market that it used to be, the food and beverage market. I think that's really intriguing.
Absolutely. It's a really neat, it's a neat space. I have a lot of respect for Liz, whom I've known for a few years. She's an amazingly talented, amazingly thoughtful, amazingly down to earth person. And, we'll have these meetings at the museum, and I'll always, and I shouldn't say always, depends on the day and the time of day and so on. Like, if we're meeting later in the afternoon at the museum, we'll sip on a little bourbon during our meeting or a little whiskey. And, Liz is right there involved with that. But, she published author, great educator, tremendous researcher. I think she's in a really good place too at the museum, just because she's not running the day-to-day operations. That's Brent Rosen now, as far as a lot of the administrative stuff and things. And she's being allowed to focus on research and curation of the exhibits and working on the podcast network and those sorts of things.
I'm trying to find her episode so I could post it. But I'm not that speedy, so I have to find it. But and I'll post it. But yeah, it was a great interview with her. So let's talk about Nitty Grits podcast. I need to get that right. Nitty Grits podcast, which I am now, Eating at a Meeting podcast is now part of this podcast network. And I'm going to read the little description here. Is a network of producers, hosts, and authors whose work examines food and drink in all its diversity across America and the world.
Yeah.
So can you explain a little bit more about that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so, as I mentioned, it is the podcast network of the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, but is certainly not limited to just the South. The shows that our growing roster of shows come from all over the place, and we're starting to look even in broader circles and regions. But the idea actually started, oh boy, probably about 4 years ago.
Okay.
And they had asked me, I was honored. They asked me if I wanted to put my show on the network back then. And I said, absolutely. And it kind of came out of the gate, I think, a little bit differently than what was intended. Part of the problem, and you know this very well, podcasts can easily come and go. I guess I'll just put it that way. And it definitely, we talked about this when you were a guest on my show, which will be out very soon, that, you're rapidly approaching your 100th episode. It takes dedication and it takes staying power. And I think a lot of people, especially in recent times, think, oh, I can do a podcast. And then you realize how much work it actually is. I've had the benefit of being involved in radio with this, so it kind of makes me do it in a lot of ways. But so it kind of just didn't really click when it came out of the gate. And I think some of the capacity of the museum to support it and all this other stuff wasn't quite there. And then right before the pandemic hit, and this is why I mentioned Brent Rosen, who took over as president of the museum, said, hey, we need to get this going again. What do you think? Would you like to help out and be more involved with it? And I said, sure. And so we actually built a little studio. I shouldn't say we, because I didn't do it, but built a studio in the museum for recording. And we were starting to talk about how we're going to make all this work and what this network's going to look like. And then the pandemic hit. So it kind of put the kibosh on a lot of it, slowed things down. And then I guess it was in November, December of this past year, we started reconvening more seriously about getting this going again. And it was a great way, even during the pandemic, we felt a great way for the museum to communicate stories and be out there. And the museum is really, I think, trying to be more of a community than just a destination for exhibits.
Okay.
We kept talking about this and how it was going to look and how it was going to feel. And we've been working on it for a while. And the description that you just read, I think, is really accurate, that we're trying to be very careful with the good shows like yours that we put on. I think we're up to 6 now. And the whole idea is to, connect drink and food and culture in some fashion. Obviously going to be some overlap, but everybody has got a different view. Everybody's got a different format. And so we've been adding about one show a month in a pretty careful way. And the whole idea is you can go to southernfood.org. You'll see the link up there.
Yep.
Lots of really cool shows. I know Roger Anderson, who was just emailed me this morning. He hosts the Kitchen Counter podcast, which is geared around the home cook. Really interesting show that way. Liz does a show. Obviously, your show. We have another one called The Connected Table, which is Melanie Young and David Ransom. And they're David's a somm and wine industry people. So lots of different shows and different lengths and things like that. But I'm so excited about it in a nutshell, Tracy, is because just to be a part of something that's a community. And you and I were talking about it when you were on my show. I think when we weren't on air, you put a show out there and it just kind of goes out there, right? It goes to whatever podcast platform, or you put it on your Facebook page or something. And this is so much more fun to do something like this, to be a part of a like-minded community and bring in lots of voices and lots of angles to the story.
Right. And in a conversation, I think overall of our conversation just about food and beverage, there's so many facets of it. And we take a lot of it for granted, and a lot of times you want to go eat the culture of a town or a city or a country that you're going to visit. And when you do it the touristy way, you're not necessarily getting that, right? So I think what our podcast network can help do is pinpoint where you can go and, and learn the realness of some of this food and beverage and culture that revolves around the cities and the food and beverage that we're looking for.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. And the topics, and some of these ones are, not like in your case, it's not geographically centered per se.
Right.
Really, my show is not all that geographically centered, other than we draw a lot of inspiration from New Orleans in different ways. Right. And, you touched on something really important, I think, too, when we're just even talking about, I don't want to say sustainability, but just, cultural integrity and these things. Mm-hmm. When you go visit somewhere, and I know for me, I'm going to explore and learn about the culture. So I want to eat the local foods. I want to meet the local people that are producing it. You want to go to the local eateries or things like that. And I'm not saying they're all bad. And if this is your thing, I apologize for this in advance. All inclusive is one of the worst hyphenates in the food and drink world, because if they're just trucking down hamburgers to you to some resort on in Mexico, what's the point in a sense?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not why you're really there. And
Right.
I do, like with the podcast network, I think it just brings so many interesting stories and so many interesting angles and interesting people to the table. No pun intended there either.
Right.
Hear from and learn more about, again, what you're consuming. And it's not all about consumption. It's also about enjoyment. And I think a lot of the shows bring that to the table as well.
I think so too. And the word dive just came. I think it was actually an answer on a New York Times mini crossword puzzle, but the authentic restaurants and bars are sometimes those dives that you don't find, or you just find on the whim when you're walking down Bourbon Street or wherever, a small street in New Orleans, or even, where I am, New Bern, North Carolina, so it's interesting to see. And actually it brings me back to a farm dinner that I went to a couple of weeks ago. And I was sitting down, two of the farmers, it was a husband and wife farmer, and they raised pigs and chickens. And they're like, I said, hey, do you know Will Harris, of Will Harris from White Oak Pastures, which is a big cattle farm and pig farm and chicken farm in Southwest Georgia. And they're like, yeah, I mean, he just to sit down with him for 5 minutes would be amazing. I'm like, okay, well, I've been there and I know his daughter. Do you want to, just, but making those connections from where you and I go to travel or whatever, and the people that we might know, but we can also help somebody else that's growing their farm. Or, I was telling them about woofers, who travel the world and want to work on farms to help farmers by also learning the culture and living in different places around the world. And that's a whole nother culture thing, is being a woofer, right?
Right. Sure. What a better way to learn about a local culture than doing exactly that.
Right. Exactly.
So much like we've been talking about.
I don't know. It's so intriguing. And I got into this because I had a food allergy. I'm a meeting planner and I had food allergies and I needed to learn how to eat. And it has taken me this 11 years. And I took that class in 2009. So however many years that was, so 12 years ago. I mean, I've learned so much just from that. Right. And I love it even more every single day. So.
Great.
Okay.
And thank you for bringing up dive bars, by the way. Dive bars are an important part of our culture as well. Don't ever forget that.
Oh my gosh, they're the best.
Absolutely.
For people watching, for eating, for drinking. Yeah, they're the best.
Absolutely. It's actually a great place to go, especially here in New Orleans. If you want to go connect with hospitality workers and learn their story and learn about their culture and things like that, in many instances, the dive bar is the place to go do that, because that's where everybody goes after they knock off from the high-end French Quarter restaurant. They don't go sit at the bar there. They go to the dive bar.
Well, that's so true. Kind of an angle, because I was sitting in a room last night with a bunch of people that were networking at the National Association of Catering and Events. So what about the catering side of that whole New Orleans? I mean, is there a whole nother realm of that hospitality world there?
Oh, absolutely. Because when I mentioned tourism and the number of people working in tourism, a huge part of that is our convention business here. Mm-hmm. It's a huge part of the economy. And this is why, the pandemic has been extra crushing to a location like this, because we've already kind of touched on the importance of tourism to the economy. Well, the convention portion of that and events portion of that is significant. And festivals, I don't want to forget that. We have in normal times, it's well over 100 sanctioned festivals in the city. Wow. So if you think about that sheer number, and we also have 2 seasons, right? And the same goes with conventions and such, where, we have a fall and a spring. We don't have as much going on in the summer, and then, winter's, the holidays and things, although we see kind of more year round. So it's when you go, wow, 100 festivals, and you consider that the vast majority of those happen in the months that are the fall and the spring, and the same with conventions, it's really packed. It's really jam-packed. And so to answer your question about catering, it's a huge industry here, because we're supplying, that industry is supplying food and drink to all these events.
Yep.
And the festivals, because it is this part of the world, I shouldn't say most of them, but most of them have a food and drink angle. I mean, look, we have a mac and cheese festival here. We have a fried chicken festival here. Oh yeah. We have, there's a million. We have a po' boy festival here. We have a Creole tomato festival here. And even the ones that are the music festivals like Jazz Fest that everybody knows, or maybe French Quarter Festival, which is my favorite, has a significant food and drink angle to it. So it's a lot of human power to make that happen. And again, that's in many cases, like with the convention stuff, it's a huge industry that people don't see. And there's a lot of people that run restaurants that also run catering companies. And the film industry is big here too. And the catering industry is an integral part of that as well.
And it just goes to show how much people we take for granted in the realm of food and beverage, right? We go to the grocery store, we buy our stuff, or we go out to dinner, and then we go home. But there's so many people behind the scenes that make it happen. And I love all of their stories. So thank you for highlighting their stories.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's 95% of, probably 99% of how it all happens is due to those people.
Right. Exactly.
Celebrity chef.
Right. Okay. So for fun, or what I've posted resources, I posted your website address, which is NOLAdrinks.com. And then I also did your Instagram, which is the same thing. Instagram, find it at NOLAdrinks. Same thing on Facebook, and on Twitter, it's NOLAdrinks1.
Somebody cyber squatting NOLAdrinks before I got to it on Twitter.
Dang it. Yeah. But so what is in this whole realm of things, and having grown up in California and living in New Orleans, do you have a favorite drink and food?
Wow. You asked me that before, getting ready for the show. It's so hard. You know what? I'll use an example to evade the question. How's that?
Okay.
Having taught a lot of wine education in my days, people ask me, what is your favorite wine? And sometimes people, and it also kind of on the same side of the coin, or same coin, different side, people say, I hate Chardonnay. Well, that's a mighty big statement to make, right? Because there's a whole world of Chardonnays from all over the world made in different styles that are out there. And somebody will say, well, what is your favorite wine? And I can't really give you an answer, because it depends on who I'm with, what I'm eating, the time of year, the time of day. I mean, it's hot here right now. I don't want to sit on my front porch and drink a big, bold Cabernet Sauvignon. That seems to scream Sauvignon Blanc to me at this point in time. So, I like things that, and this goes for food as well, just things that are well made, come with quality, come with a story, like we've talked about, maybe sometimes a little bit interesting or a little different. And, now in this world of cell phones and stuff, without being rude, it's, kind of fun to pull your phone out and look up a bottle of wine and get the story of what grapes are in it and where it comes from. And, and people write good tasting notes about how the wine was made. So It really, it's such a big world out there that I just have a hard time picking a favorite, to be honest.
That's fair. I mean, and that just means you enjoy a lot lot of it. So
yeah, it's such a big, like we just said, it's a big world out there. So much to enjoy that, why limit yourself?
Oh, I love that. Okay. So I know I've tagged you, or I've added the comments, but this is an audio show. So tell everybody verbally how they can find you.
Yeah, for sure. So as you said, NOLAdrinks.com is our website, and NOLA drinks. And NOLA is, of course, New Orleans, Louisiana, for those of you who don't know. I think most people know that by now. And as you mentioned, at NOLAdrinks on Facebook and Instagram, and at NOLAdrinks1 on Twitter. Go to the Southern Food and Beverage Museum website, southernfood.org. Right at the top, you'll see a blog and podcast. You click on that. Nitty Grits podcasts are there. It's a great way to find my show, your show, all these other good shows. And hopefully we don't go too far off this cliff yet again with the pandemic. I'm easily found on Friday afternoons at certain watering holes in restaurants in New Orleans, too, if you want.
I should have found you when I was there a couple of weeks ago. So, yeah.
We'll do it next time you come back.
Oh, yes, sir. For sure. Well, Bryan, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm so excited to be working with you on the Nitty Grits network and podcasts. So we're going to be doing this a lot more. So
that's great, Tracy. Thank you so much. It's been a blast. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And everybody, thank you for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, a podcast of the Nitty Gritty podcasts. And that's a lot to say. We talk about food and beverage, all aspects of it, in an effort to create safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences. And until next time, stay safe and eat well. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.